She hid in an abandoned cabin deep in the mountains, running from something she didn't understand. Just trying to survive one more night, nothing more. What she didn't know, the man who found her first was no ordinary stranger, but a prince from a hidden world. And he'd been searching for her longer than she could imagine. The lights came first, then the silence. Emma Brooks stood behind a curtain of pine branches, barely breathing, watching a strange golden glow settle over the Hendricks house at the edge of town. It lasted only a few seconds. When it faded, Mrs. Hendricks was gone. Not hiding, not asleep. Gone, the way a candle goes out when you pinch the wick. Nobody in town could explain it. 3 people had vanished this month alone, always the same way. A flash of light near their home, and then nothing. The local paper called it a gas leak hallucination. The old-timers at the diner called it something else. They called it being claimed. Emma didn't wait to find out which explanation was true. She worked at the community greenhouse on the edge of Millbrook, coaxing tomatoes and stubborn roses out of soil that never seemed rich enough. It wasn't much of a life, but it was quiet, and quiet had always been enough for her. That changed 3 nights ago, when she caught her own reflection in the greenhouse window and saw something impossible burned faintly into her wrist. A symbol, delicate as lace, glowing the same pale gold as the light that had swallowed Mrs. Hendricks whole. It vanished before she could look twice. But she knew what she'd seen. She didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up, she'd already decided. If something out there was marking people before it took them, she wasn't going to sit in her rented cottage and wait her turn. She packed light, dried food, a water bottle, a flashlight, and the small folding knife her father left her, and slipped out before dawn while the town was still dark and quiet. She knew these mountains better than most people knew their own backyard. Years of hiking trails alone had taught her which ridges disappeared into fog and which valleys nobody bothered to map. She headed for the one place she was certain no one would think to look. An old forest ranger cabin, buried deep in the Cascade Range, half swallowed by moss and time. She'd stumbled onto it years ago while picking wildflowers for the greenhouse, and never told a soul about it. Not even her closest friend. It felt, back then, like a secret worth keeping just for herself. Now it might be the only thing standing between her and whatever had taken Mrs. Hendricks. The cabin was smaller than she remembered, one room with a stone fireplace and a roof that sagged in the corner, but it held against the wind. She rationed the vegetables she'd grabbed from the greenhouse storage, collected rainwater in an old pot she found under the floorboards, and told herself this was temporary. A few days of hiding, and whatever was happening in town would either pass or make sense. For 2 days, nothing happened. She almost let herself believe she'd overreacted. Then the storm rolled in on the second night, thunder shaking the thin windows, rain hammering the roof like something trying to get in. Emma sat wrapped in a blanket near the dying fire, telling herself the sounds outside were just branches, just wind, just weather. A knock came at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not the wild rattle of a loose shutter. A person's knock. Emma froze, her hand tightening around the folding knife in her lap. Nobody knew this cabin existed. Nobody could have followed her up here, not through the trail she'd taken, not in this storm. The knock came again, patient, almost gentle. She crossed the room on silent feet and pressed her eye to the gap beside the door frame. Lightning cracked across the sky, and for a single bright second, she saw him clearly. A young man stood on the porch, soaked from the rain but strangely unbothered by it, dressed in clothes the color of deep forest green, cut in a style she couldn't place. Not quite modern, not quite anything she'd seen before. His eyes caught the next flash of lightning and held a faint shimmer that no human eyes should have. Every instinct told her to stay silent, to let him think the cabin was empty. But before she could stop herself, her hand moved to the latch. The door creaked open just enough to see him fully. He didn't step forward. He didn't reach for her. He simply looked at her the way someone looks at a person they've been searching for a very long time. "My name is Adrian," he said, his voice calm against the roar of the storm behind him. "I've finally found you before they did." Emma's grip tightened on the knife, her heart slamming against her ribs. Whatever he was, he already knew exactly who she was, and that terrified her more than the lights ever had. Emma didn't sleep, not really. She sat by the fire with the knife across her knees. watching the strange man who called himself Adrian settle onto the floor near the door, as if he intended to keep watch all night without asking anything of her. He hadn't tried to come closer. He hadn't tried to explain himself either, not beyond his name and that one unsettling sentence. "I've finally found you before they did." Before who did? She wasn't about to sit around and find out. By the time the storm cleared, gray light was creeping through the cracks in the shutters. Adrian had drifted off, or looked like he had, his back against the wall, eyes closed. Emma barely breathed as she gathered her bag. She'd survived plenty of things alone. She could survive this too. She slipped out while he was still occupied at first light, patching a section of the roof the storm had torn loose. An odd thing for someone chasing her to bother doing, she thought. But she didn't stop to question her luck. She was 3 ridgelines away before the sun fully cleared the treetops. The forest felt different that morning. Wrong? Somehow, though she couldn't say exactly why. She followed the old logging road she'd used a dozen times before, but 20 minutes in, it simply stopped existing. Where a clear dirt path should have curved around a stand of cedar trees, there was nothing but dense, tangled brush, as if the road had never been cut at all. She backtracked, tried a different trail she knew by heart, and found the same thing. Paths closing like doors. Trees that seemed to lean in the wrong direction, blocking routes that had been open her entire life. Vines she didn't recognize crept across the ground ahead of her, faintly glowing at the edges, curling away only when she stepped back. Her pulse climbed. This wasn't a trick of exhaustion or bad light. Something was actively keeping her from leaving. She pressed on anyway, cutting through unmarked brush, scrambling over a fallen log slick with morning dew. That was when she heard it, a sound like wind moving through feathers, except there was no wind. She dropped low behind a boulder and looked up. 3 birds circled above the tree line, larger than any hawk she'd ever seen, their feathers shimmering with the same faint gold light that had swallowed Mrs. Hendricks whole. Beneath them, moving through the trees with unnatural grace, were figures she hadn't seen approaching at all. Tall, elegant, dressed in clothing that shifted color like oil on water. They moved without disturbing a single branch, scanning the forest floor with sharp, searching eyes. Emma pressed herself flat against the boulder, heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. One of the birds let out a piercing cry and dove toward a thicket less than 50 feet from where she hid. For a moment she thought she'd been found. Then it pulled up sharply, circling back to its rider, and the group moved on, sweeping the forest like search dogs on a scent they hadn't quite caught yet. They were looking for her. Whatever these things were, they were real, and they were close. Adrian hadn't been lying. If anything, he'd been telling the truth in the gentlest way possible, softening something far more dangerous than she'd let herself imagine. She didn't get long to sit with that realization. A hand closed gently around her arm, and she nearly screamed before a familiar voice whispered close to her ear. "Don't move yet. They haven't seen you." Adrian crouched beside her, his green clothing now dulled to a shade that blended almost perfectly with the underbrush. She wanted to demand how he'd found her so fast, how he moved through this forest like it belonged to him. But there wasn't time for questions. The birds cried out again, closer this time. "They're called trackers," Adrian murmured. "They can sense the mark on your wrist if you're out in the open too long. We need to move, now quietly." Emma's mind raced through a dozen reasons not to trust him, and none of them mattered as much as the very real danger circling above the trees. She nodded once, and he moved. He led her low along the boulder line, away from the direction the trackers had gone, weaving through brush that seemed to part slightly for him in a way it never had for her. Behind them, one of the enchanted birds shrieked, sharp and sudden, and Emma's stomach dropped. They'd caught something. A scent. A trace. She didn't know. But the sound sent every nerve in her body into a full sprint even as her legs already burned from running. "This way," Adrian said, pulling her toward a wall of solid rock that looked like nothing but a dead end. Emma nearly resisted, certain he was leading her into a trap, but the trackers' cries were closing in behind them, and she had no better option left. Adrian pressed his palm flat against the stone and murmured something too quiet for Emma to catch. The rock shimmered, then split apart like water rippling around a stone, revealing a narrow passage hidden inside the mountainside itself. He pulled her through, and the wall sealed seamlessly behind them, swallowing the sound of the birds completely. Inside, the passage was dim but calm, lit faintly by veins of pale light running through the stone walls like something alive. Emma pressed her back against the cool rock, chest heaving, trying to process what she'd just seen. "They can't find us in here," Adrian said quietly. "This path isn't marked on any map, human or otherwise." Emma studied him in the strange half-light. This man who moved through impossible places and spoke of things hunting her like it was simple fact. Everything about the last 24 hours told her to keep running, to trust no one, especially not someone who seemed to know exactly what she was before she understood it herself. But the birds had been real. The trackers had been real. And he had just saved her life without asking for anything in return. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Start explaining. All of it." For the first time since the knock at her door, Emma didn't pull away when Adrian offered his hand to help her forward into the dark. The hidden passage stretched on for nearly a mile before opening into a narrow ravine Emma didn't recognize, one that eventually led them down out of the mountains entirely. Adrian didn't say much as they walked, only that they needed distance before he could safely explain anything further. Emma didn't push. She was still catching up to the fact that magic was real, that something had been hunting her through her own backyard, and that the man beside her seemed to know far more about her life than she'd ever told anyone. By the second day of walking, hitching rides along quiet back roads, and resting only when Adrian insisted the coast was clear, they crossed into Northern California. The redwoods here were older than anything Emma had ever stood beneath, trunks wide as small houses, their canopies swallowing the sky so completely that afternoon felt like dusk. Hidden among them, half buried in ferns and creeping ivy, stood a Victorian mansion that looked as though the forest itself had been trying to reclaim it for 100 years. "Ashwood Manor," Adrian said, stopping at the edge of the overgrown drive. "It belonged to a family who understood what you are, long before either of us were born." The house groaned as they stepped inside, floorboards soft with age, dust hanging thick in shafts of light from broken windows. Emma expected it to feel abandoned, but instead it felt like a held breath, like the whole place had been waiting patiently for someone to return. Adrian led her to a library at the back of the house, shelves collapsed in places, books swollen with old water damage, but enough remained intact for him to search with quiet determination. Emma wandered along the far wall, running her fingers over cracked leather spines, until one caught her attention, a journal bound in faded green cloth, her own family's surname stamped faintly on the cover in gold lettering worn nearly smooth. Her breath caught. "Brooks," she whispered. "This says Brooks." Adrian looked up sharply, crossing the room in a few quick strides. "Read it." The handwriting inside was old, careful, clearly written by someone who understood they were recording something important. Emma sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and began to read aloud, piecing together sentences faded by time. The journal belonged to a woman named Cora Brooks, who had lived in this house nearly 200 years earlier. Cora wrote of a family duty passed down through generations, of humans born with a particular gift meant to keep two separate worlds from drifting too far apart. She wrote about marks that appeared on the skin only when the balance between those worlds grew dangerously thin, marks that chose their bearers rather than the other way around. Emma's hand drifted unconsciously to her wrist, where the golden symbol had briefly appeared days ago. "It's not a curse," she said slowly, looking up at Adrian. "Whatever this is, it's not something that's hunting me." "No," Adrian agreed, kneeling beside her. "It's a seal, one of the oldest kinds. It only surfaces in someone capable of restoring balance when the world starts slipping out of alignment." "Restoring balance," Emma repeated. "That's not what your people think, is it? The ones with the birds. They think I'm something to be caught." Adrian's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain how to answer. "The court doesn't see it the way Cora did. They see the mark as something to claim and control, not understand. That's part of why I needed to find you before they did." Emma sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling slowly. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't prey. She was something else entirely, something with a purpose she hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore now that she knew it existed. They spent the rest of the afternoon searching the library for anything more Cora might have left behind, but the remaining pages had crumbled beyond reading, the ink lost to decades of damp air. Still, what they'd found was enough to shift something in Emma. She no longer felt like someone running blindly from a threat she didn't understand. She felt, for the first time since the lights had taken Mrs. Hendricks, like she might actually have some control over what happened next. Miles away, in a place no map could show, a very different conversation was unfolding. Queen Briar stood in the heart of a court built from living wood and pale, endless light, her expression unreadable as a tracker knelt before her, delivering news that had clearly not pleased her. They passed through the mountain seal near the ridge, the tracker said. Adrian found her first. Queen Briar's fingers tightened slightly around the arm of her throne, the only visible sign of her displeasure. Of course he did. He's been searching for this one longer than most of you have served me. Silas Thorne stepped forward from the shadows near the edge of the court, tall and composed, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested years of practice hiding whatever he actually felt. Send me, Silas said simply. I'll bring her back before she learns anything Adrian doesn't want her to unlearn. Queen Briar studied him for a long moment. She cannot be allowed to understand her role before the ceremony. Not from him. Not from anyone. Understood, Silas said, bowing his head. Bring her back quietly if you can, the queen continued. But bring her back regardless of how quiet it needs to be. Silas didn't respond beyond another small bow before turning and disappearing into the shifting light beyond the throne, already moving. Back at Ashwood Manor, Emma closed the journal gently, feeling the weight of everything it had told her settle into place beside the fear that had driven her into the mountains in the first place. They're going to keep hunting me either way, aren't they? She said. It wasn't really a question. Adrian met her eyes, something quietly protective in his expression that Emma hadn't expected from someone she'd met only 2 days earlier. Yes, but now you know what they're actually afraid of. That's more than most people ever get. Outside, the redwoods swayed gently in the evening wind, indifferent to the two figures standing in the doorway of a house that had waited 2 centuries to finally be understood. Emma didn't know yet what restoring balance would actually require of her, but for the first time since this began, she wasn't running from the answer. She was walking toward it. They reached Seattle 2 days later, slipping into the city the way Adrian seemed to slip into most places, quietly, without drawing a single glance. Emma had expected hiding to feel harder somewhere so crowded, but Adrian explained it plainly as they walked beneath the gray afternoon sky. Cities are full of noise, he said. Too many people, too many distractions. It's easier to disappear inside chaos than inside silence. Emma understood the logic even if the noise made her uneasy after days spent surrounded by forest. They found a cheap motel near the market district, paying with cash Adrian produced without explanation, and Emma didn't ask where it came from. She was learning, slowly, that some questions could wait. Their reason for coming to Seattle wasn't just safety. Adrian believed an old bookstore somewhere in the city held something important. Hidden maps kept beneath its basement floor that could help Emma understand more about the seal on her wrist and the ceremony the Fae court intended to force on her if they caught up first. A ceremony, Emma repeated as they walked through wet streets crowded with umbrellas. You still haven't told me exactly what that means for me. I will, Adrian said. Once we're somewhere safer than an open sidewalk. Emma let it go for the moment, though the avoidance didn't sit easily with her. Everything about this world still felt like pieces of a story she was only allowed to hear one careful sentence at a time. They spent the better part of 2 days searching for the bookstore, a place Adrian remembered only from stories passed between older Fae who trusted him enough to talk freely. Most shopkeepers had never heard of it. A few gave him strange, knowing looks before claiming otherwise. Emma began to suspect some of them knew exactly what he was and simply didn't want to get involved. It was on the 3rd day, tucked behind a narrow alley near the waterfront, that they finally found it. A shop with no sign, windows fogged with age, a bell above the door that rang with a tone slightly too musical to be ordinary metal. Inside, shelves rose higher than seemed physically possible for the building's exterior, crowded with books in languages Emma didn't recognize. An elderly woman behind the counter looked up once, studied Adrian for a long moment, then nodded toward a door at the back, without a single word exchanged between them. The basement held exactly what Adrian had promised. Beneath a loose floor panel, wrapped carefully in cloth that smelled faintly of cedar, they found a set of hand-drawn maps marking locations Emma had never heard of, places labeled in careful script as sanctuaries, thresholds, and old meeting grounds between the two worlds. "This will show us where to go next," Adrian said, relief clear in his voice for the first time since she'd met him. "There's a sanctuary in Olympic National Forest. If the maps are accurate, it holds the full history of the claiming." Everything Cora couldn't finish explaining. Emma studied the careful lines on the aged parchment, tracing a path that would take them further from everything familiar. Part of her missed her small cottage, her quiet work at the greenhouse, a life that had felt ordinary until 3 glowing lights and a knock at a cabin door had unraveled it completely. She didn't say that out loud. There wasn't room for homesickness in the middle of whatever this had become. They left the shop as evening settled over the city, the streets slick and glowing under scattered lamplight. That was when Emma first noticed something wasn't right. A cluster of tulips bloomed suddenly along a sidewalk crack, vivid red against gray concrete, though it was the wrong season entirely for any of them to be blooming at all. A few streets later, she caught her own reflection in a shop window moving half a second behind her actual steps, as if it hadn't quite decided to follow along. "Adrian," she said quietly, "is it just me? Or is something strange happening?" He followed her gaze toward the harbor, where faint lights drifted just above the water, delicate and unnatural, like lanterns with no source holding them aloft. His expression shifted from calm to visibly concerned. "The boundary is weakening," he said, "faster than it should be this early in the cycle." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the barrier separating our worlds isn't holding the way it used to. Small things start slipping through first, illusions, flickers, harmless echoes. But if it keeps thinning, eventually it won't just be flowers and reflections crossing over." Emma watched the lights drift silently over the dark water, oddly beautiful despite everything Adrian had just said. "Is that connected to me? To the seal?" Adrian hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "The longer the mark stays unclaimed and unresolved, the more strain it puts on the balance itself. You're not causing this directly, but the longer we wait to understand your role, the worse it's likely to get." The weight of that settled heavily in Emma's chest. She hadn't asked for any of this. Not the mark, not the danger, not the responsibility of an entire fragile balance resting somewhere inside her. But standing there watching impossible lights drift silently over an ordinary city harbor, she understood there was no version of her old life left to go back to. Not really. Not anymore. They didn't linger near the water long. Adrian kept glancing over his shoulder, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there earlier in the day, and Emma had learned enough by now to trust that instinct. "We should move," he said finally. "Somewhere quieter, somewhere we can rest before heading toward Olympic Forest at first light." Emma nodded, tucking the rolled maps carefully inside her jacket. As they turned down a narrow street away from the harbor, she caught one last glimpse of the strange lights fading slowly over the water behind them, and a quieter, more unsettling thought settled in alongside her fear. Somewhere out there, Silas Thorne was already closing the distance between them, and the closer he came, the less time Emma had to understand what she was supposed to become before someone else decided it for her. They left Seattle before sunrise, following the winding roads that carried them west into the deep green folds of Olympic National Forest. Adrian said little during the drive, his eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than Emma liked, and she didn't need to ask why. Whatever had been closing in near the harbor hadn't disappeared just because they'd left the city behind. The forest here felt older than anywhere they'd been so far, thick with moss that hung from every branch like something out of a memory rather than a real place. According to the map, the sanctuary lay several miles off any marked trail, hidden deep enough that no casual hiker would ever stumble across it by accident. It took most of the day to reach it. When they finally did, Emma understood immediately why it had stayed hidden for so long. A wide clearing opened among the trees, ringed by weathered stone pillars taller than either of them, arranged in a perfect circle around a flat central stone worn smooth by centuries of rain. Faint carvings covered every pillar, symbols that seemed to shift slightly when Emma looked at them directly, though she couldn't have explained how that was possible. "This is one of the oldest sanctuaries left," Adrian said quietly, stepping carefully into the circle. "Older than the court itself, older than the claiming as anyone practices it now." Emma followed him inside, and the moment she crossed the ring of stones, the carvings around them began to glow faintly, pale gold light tracing each symbol like ink spreading through water. The mark on her wrist responded instantly, warming against her skin, glowing in answer. "They recognize you," Adrian said, something like awe in his voice. The carvings shifted slowly across the stone, forming images rather than symbols now, and Emma watched, transfixed, as the history Cora's journal had only hinted at played out silently around her. She saw, in flickering light, two worlds existing side by side long ago, humans and Fae working together rather than in secrecy or fear. She saw guardians chosen not by force but by willingness, marked individuals who volunteered to protect the fragile boundary between both realms, honored rather than hunted for the gift they carried. Then the images shifted, darker now, showing ambitious rulers within the Fae court who grew impatient with willing guardians and the slow trust required to find them. She watched the original agreement twist gradually into something else entirely, a forced ritual, the claiming, designed to seize marked individuals whether they consented or not, binding them permanently to serve the court's interests instead of the balance itself. Emma's stomach turned as the final image settled into place, showing countless marked humans across centuries taken from their lives without choice, their names lost to time, their purpose stripped down to nothing more than a tool for a court more interested in control than balance. "They didn't just complicate the ritual," Emma said slowly, understanding crashing over her all at once. "They corrupted the entire purpose of it." "Yes," Adrian said quietly. "The claiming isn't supposed to be a hunt. It was never meant to be. Somewhere along the way, the court forgot, or simply decided they preferred it their way instead." Emma turned to face him fully, the glow of the ancient carvings casting soft light across both their faces. "So when Queen Briar sends people like Silas after me, she isn't restoring some sacred duty. She's continuing something broken." "Exactly," Adrian said. "And it's why I couldn't let them find you first. If they'd claimed you the way they intend to, you would never have known any of this. You would have simply become another guardian bound against her will, believing it was your only option." Something in Emma's chest loosened slightly, a fear she hadn't fully named finally settling into clearer shape. She hadn't been running from her responsibility this whole time. She'd been running from a threat pretending to be one. "I wasn't meant to belong to anyone," she said slowly, testing the words as they left her mouth. "I was meant to fix what they broke." Adrian nodded, watching her carefully, as though giving her space to arrive at the realization fully on her own terms rather than his. The mark chooses guardians capable of restoring the original agreement. Not obedience, restoration. Emma looked down at her wrist, where the faint golden symbol still glowed softly, warm against her skin instead of frightening for the first time since she'd first noticed it in the greenhouse window. It didn't feel like a curse anymore. It didn't even feel entirely like a burden. It felt, for the first time, like something she might actually be capable of carrying. The light around the stone circle began to dim slowly as the visions faded, the carvings settling back into quiet, ordinary stone. Emma stood in the growing dusk, turning everything over in her mind, when a distant sound cut sharply through the stillness of the forest, the same piercing cry she remembered from the mountains days earlier. Adrian's head snapped up immediately, his relaxed posture vanishing in an instant. Trackers, closer than they should be. Emma's pulse spiked, the calm of the sanctuary shattering in a single breath. "How did they find us all the way out here?" "They didn't find us," Adrian said grimly, already moving toward the edge of the clearing. "They found your magic. It's growing stronger the more you understand it, which means it's getting harder to hide." The realization hit her hard. The very thing that was helping her understand who she was meant to be was also making her easier to track. A cruel kind of trade she hadn't anticipated. "We need to move," Adrian said, offering his hand without hesitation. Emma took it without a second thought this time, no hesitation left in the gesture at all. Whatever came next, she wasn't the frightened woman who'd fled her cottage before sunrise anymore. She had a purpose now, however dangerous, and she intended to see it through. Together they slipped out of the sanctuary and back into the darkening trees, the ancient stones falling silent behind them, keeping their secrets exactly as they had for centuries, waiting patiently for the next guardian brave enough to listen. They didn't stop moving for 2 full days, cutting east through backroads and forest trails until the mountains gave way to the dramatic cliffs and waterfalls of the Columbia River Gorge. Adrian chose the route deliberately, he explained, because the shifting winds and rushing water made it harder for trackers to follow a scent trail cleanly. Emma didn't fully understand the mechanics of it, but she trusted him more with each passing mile, a shift she noticed in herself with quiet surprise. A week ago, she wouldn't have followed a stranger through a storm, let alone across 3 states. They found shelter in a small riverside town, renting a room above an old diner where the owner didn't ask questions as long as they paid in cash. For the first time since Ashwood Manor, they had a night without running, without hiding behind rocks or slipping through hidden passages, and the stillness felt almost unfamiliar. Emma sat by the window that evening, watching the river catch the last orange light of sunset, when Adrian settled into the chair across from her, quieter than usual. "You should try reaching for it," he said. "The mark. Now, while we have a moment of calm." Emma glanced down at her wrist, the faint golden lines invisible unless the light caught them just right. "Reaching for it how? I don't even know what it's supposed to do." "That's exactly why you should try," Adrian said. "It doesn't respond to force. From what I've seen the last few days, it responds to something else entirely." Emma closed her eyes, unsure what she was even supposed to feel for. She thought of Mrs. Hendricks, swallowed by golden light before anyone understood what was happening. She thought of the guardians in the sanctuary visions, chosen not for power, but for willingness to protect something larger than themselves. She thought, without meaning to, of the fear she'd felt hiding in that cabin, and how it had slowly turned into something steadier the longer she understood what she carried. Warmth spread gently across her wrist, and when she opened her eyes, the mark glowed faintly, steady and calm, no urgency to it at all. "It responds to compassion," Adrian said quietly, watching the light with something like wonder. "Honesty. Protecting others instead of protecting yourself. That's the difference between you and the way the court tries to use it. They want obedience. The mark wants intention." Emma studied the gentle glow, turning her wrist slightly in the fading light. "That's not what I expected magic to feel like." "Most people expect it to feel like power," Adrian said. "It rarely does. Not the kind that matters, anyway." They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, the river outside murmuring steadily past the window. Emma found herself studying Adrian more closely than she had allowed herself to before, curious about the parts of his story he still hadn't shared. "Why you?" she asked eventually. "Out of everyone in the court, why were you the one sent to find me?" Adrian was quiet long enough that Emma thought he might avoid the question the way he'd avoided others before. But this time he didn't. "I wasn't sent," he said. "Not officially. I've spent years searching on my own, long before Queen Briar knew your mark had surfaced." Emma frowned, turning to face him fully. "Why would you do that? What could a stranger possibly mean to you?" "You weren't a stranger to me," Adrian said carefully. "Not in the way you think. My mother was a guardian once, chosen the same way you were, born with a mark she never asked for. The court claimed her the old way, forced the ceremony before she understood any of it. The same fate they intend for you now." Emma's chest tightened, understanding settling in slowly. "What happened to her?" "She spent the rest of her life bound to duties she never agreed to," Adrian said, his voice quieter now, edged with old grief he clearly didn't share often. "I watched her lose pieces of herself to a system built on control instead of choice. I promised myself that if I ever found another guardian before the court did, I would make sure she had the truth first. A real choice, not a forced one." The weight of his honesty settled between them, gentler than Emma expected. She had spent days wondering what motivated a Fey prince to risk everything chasing after a frightened human gardener he'd never met. Now she understood it wasn't about duty to the court at all. It never had been. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not letting them get to me first." Adrian met her eyes, something unspoken passing quietly between them, neither of them rushing to fill the silence with anything more than what needed to be said. The moment didn't last long. A soft knock echoed from downstairs, followed by the muffled voice of the diner owner, speaking to someone Emma didn't recognize. Adrian's posture stiffened instantly, all warmth vanishing from his expression in a heartbeat. "That's not a guest," he said quietly, already rising from his chair. Emma's pulse spiked. "Silas, maybe not yet," Adrian said, moving toward the window, "but close. He's found traces of your magic. It's stronger now, easier to follow, exactly like I warned you it would be." Emma grabbed her bag instinctively, old fear rising again despite the calm that had settled over her only minutes earlier. "How much time do we have?" "Not much," Adrian said grimly, glancing toward the stairs. "We move now," quietly, "before he confirms which room we're in." They slipped out through a back stairwell moments later. The warm stillness of the evening shattered completely, replaced by the familiar tension of running that had defined nearly every day since the knock at the cabin door. But as they disappeared into the darkening streets along the river, Emma carried something new with her this time, steadier than fear had ever been. Trust, hard-won and fully hers now, standing firmly beside the purpose she was only beginning to understand. They crossed into Idaho by the second morning, following a route Adrian chose with unusual care, weaving through small mountain towns rather than open highways. Emma didn't ask why. She'd learned by now that his caution always meant something, even when he didn't explain it right away. "There's an old mining town east of here," Adrian said as they drove, "abandoned for almost a century. Beneath it, there's a network of caverns most people forgot even existed. If the maps are right, one of them holds an archive older than anything we've found so far." "An archive of what?" Emma asked. "Memory," Adrian said simply. "Preserved the way only certain kinds of magic can preserve it." The mining town, when they reached it, looked like something time had simply passed over rather than destroyed. Weathered buildings leaned against each other along a single dirt road, windows broken, doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. Adrian led her past the old structures toward a collapsed mine entrance half hidden by overgrown brush, and beyond it, a narrow crack in the rock face that widened just enough for them to slip through sideways. The tunnel beyond descended steeply, cool air rushing up to meet them, carrying a faint mineral scent Emma couldn't quite place. After nearly 20 minutes of careful climbing, the narrow passage opened suddenly into a cavern so vast and strange that Emma stopped walking entirely, momentarily forgetting every reason she had to keep moving. Crystals rose from the cavern floor and ceiling in massive clusters, some taller than the two of them combined, glowing faintly from within with soft, shifting colors that pulsed gently like something breathing. The light they gave off painted the entire cavern in slow-moving waves of blue and gold, reflected endlessly across thousands of smaller crystal formations scattered throughout the space. "This is incredible," Emma whispered, her voice barely carrying in the vast quiet. "This is the archive," Adrian said, equally quiet, clearly moved by the sight despite having likely seen wonders Emma couldn't imagine. "Every crystal holds a memory. Guardians who came before you, moments the court would rather forget existed at all." Emma stepped closer to the nearest formation, and the moment her fingers brushed its surface, the world around her shifted entirely. She saw a young woman standing in a field of wildflowers centuries ago, marked wrist raised toward the sky, willingly accepting a role passed down through her family long before the claiming had twisted into something forced. She saw a man in old colonial clothing, protecting a hidden phase settlement from discovery, trusted completely by both worlds he moved between. Vision after vision unfolded around her, generations of guardians who had carried the same mark she now carried, each one choosing compassion and protection over fear or power. When the visions finally released her, Emma stumbled back, breathless, tears she hadn't expected gathering at the edges of her eyes. "They were real," she said softly. "All of them. My family did this again and again, long before I ever knew any of it existed." "The mark doesn't choose randomly," Adrian said gently. "It chooses bloodlines capable of carrying that kind of intention forward generation after generation. You're not the first Brooks to stand in a place like this. You won't be the last if the court has its way." Emma wiped her eyes, steadying herself against the glowing crystal beside her. For the first time, the weight of her family's legacy didn't feel like a burden thrust upon her unfairly. It felt like something she belonged to, something worth protecting properly instead of running from. That steadiness didn't last long. A sharp cry echoed through the tunnel behind them, followed quickly by the sound of footsteps on stone, deliberate and unhurried. Emma turned just as a tall figure stepped into the cavern's shifting light, flanked by two trackers whose enchanted birds perched silently on their shoulders. Silas Thorne studied the cavern with cool, careful eyes before settling his gaze on Emma. "You've led her somewhere new," Silas said to Adrian, something almost like respect buried beneath his flat tone. "Impressive, all things considered." "It won't matter." Adrian stepped slightly in front of Emma, tension coiling through his entire frame. "She's not going anywhere with you, Silas." "That decision isn't hers to make," Silas said calmly. "Nor yours." Emma's heart pounded, old fear threatening to rise the way it had in the mountains days earlier. But something steadier held firm beneath it this time, the quiet warmth of everything she'd just witnessed inside the crystal's memory. Instead of running, Emma stepped forward, past Adrian's protective stance, meeting Silas's gaze directly. "You're not here to protect balance," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "You're here because Queen Briar is afraid of what happens if people learn the truth about the claiming." Silas's expression flickered, just barely. "You don't understand what you're speaking about." "I understand more than you think," Emma said. "I've seen what this archive holds. Guardians who chose this path freely, for centuries, until your court decided free choice was inconvenient." The trackers behind Silas exchanged a glance, subtle but unmistakable, and Emma felt something shift in the cavern's tense atmosphere. Rather than retreating, Emma reached toward the nearest crystal cluster, letting the mark on her wrist respond to the ancient magic around her. Light spread from her fingertips through the crystal formations, gentle rather than forceful, sealing the deepest chambers of the archive from anyone seeking to misuse the knowledge inside, while leaving the entrance untouched, allowing everyone present to leave unharmed. Silas watched the display with something unreadable crossing his usually composed features. "That wasn't an attack," he said slowly, almost to himself. "It was never meant to be," Emma replied. "I'm not what you were warned about." The two trackers behind Silas shifted uneasily, exchanging another glance that lingered longer this time. Whatever certainty had brought them into this cavern moments ago seemed noticeably shaken by what they'd just witnessed. Silas didn't move to pursue her further. Instead, he studied Emma for a long, quiet moment, something calculating behind his careful expression. "This isn't finished," he said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. He turned without another word, motioning for the trackers to follow, disappearing back into the tunnel the way they'd come. Emma watched them go, chest still pounding, aware that something important had shifted in that cavern beyond just the sealed archive behind her. She had faced Silas Thorne directly for the first time, and instead of fear, she'd offered him the truth. Whether that truth would be enough remained to be seen. They didn't run after the crystal caverns. For the first time since the knock at the cabin door, Emma made the decision herself, calm and certain in a way that surprised even Adrian. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said, as they sat outside the abandoned mining town under a sky just beginning to lighten with dawn. "Silas said this wasn't finished. He's right. But I want to finish it on my terms, not while running from the court forever." Adrian studied her carefully, concern etched into his expression. "Walking into the Heartwood court means walking directly into Queen Briar's reach. If this goes wrong, there won't be a hidden passage to save us." "I know," Emma said. "But if I keep running, she keeps hunting. Somewhere out there, another guardian is going to be born into this same fear someday. I want to end it before that happens again." Adrian didn't argue further. He recognized, Emma suspected, the same steady resolve his own mother must have lacked the chance to carry when the court claimed her against her will. The entrance to the hidden Fey realm lay beneath the Oregon forest they'd started this journey in, fittingly enough, accessible only through a grove Adrian knew well from his childhood. He pressed his palm against an ancient tree trunk wrapped in silver moss, murmuring words Emma couldn't quite catch, and the ground beneath them shimmered before opening into a staircase of pale light descending into the earth. The Heartwood court took her breath away the moment they emerged from the passage. Towering trees grew impossibly tall overhead, their canopies woven together into a ceiling that glowed with soft, shifting light, no sun or sky visible anywhere above them. Delicate bridges of living with connected platforms carved directly into massive trunks, and everywhere Emma looked, fey and flowing, color-shifting clothing paused to watch the two of them walk deeper into the heart of the realm. Whispers followed them the entire way, quiet and curious rather than hostile, though Emma caught more than a few uneasy glances directed at the faint mark visible on her wrist. Queen Briar waited at the center of the court, seated upon a throne grown directly from a living tree, its branches curling protectively around her like a crown. Silas stood near her side, his expression unreadable, though his eyes tracked Emma's approach with far more attention than before. "You've come willingly," Queen Briar said, studying Emma with sharp, assessing eyes. "That's either very brave or very foolish." "I came to stop this," Emma said, steadying her voice despite the weight of dozens of watching eyes. "Not to be claimed. To end the reason you feel the need to claim anyone at all." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the surrounding court. Queen Briar's expression tightened slightly, though she gestured for Emma to continue, perhaps curious enough or confident enough to allow it. Emma reached into her jacket and withdrew Cora's fragile journal, along with the rolled maps they'd carried since Seattle, laying them carefully at the base of the throne's platform. "I know what the claiming was supposed to be," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed court. "A partnership between willing guardians and your people, chosen through trust, not force. I've seen it myself, in a sanctuary older than this ceremony, in an archive holding the memories of guardians who chose this path freely for generations." She turned slowly, addressing the gathered fae rather than only the queen. Somewhere along the way, that agreement was twisted into something else, into fear, into hunting instead of choosing. "I'm not the first person your court has tried to force into this. I won't be the last unless someone finally says it out loud." Queen Briar rose slowly from her throne, her expression carefully composed despite the visible tension rippling through the court around her. "You speak of ancient history as though it changes present necessity. The balance between our worlds still requires guardians, regardless of how you feel about the method. It requires willing guardians," Emma said firmly. "Not captured ones. The mark itself proves that. It doesn't respond to force, Your Majesty. It responds to compassion and choice. That's not something I discovered by accident. That's something it taught me, the same way it clearly taught guardians long before me." Silas shifted beside the throne, his composed expression finally cracking slightly as something unreadable passed behind his eyes. "She's not lying," Silas said quietly, drawing surprised glances from those nearest him. "I witnessed it myself, in the Crystal Caverns. She sealed an entire archive without force, protecting its knowledge rather than claiming it for herself. That's not the behavior the court warned us to expect." Queen Briar's gaze snapped toward Silas, sharp and displeased. "You would side against your own queen over the word of a human." "I would side with the truth," Silas said, steadier now, "wherever it happens to come from. I've served the claiming faithfully for longer than most in this court have been alive. I won't continue enforcing something I now understand to be built on a lie." Murmurs spread rapidly through the gathered crowd, no longer quiet or uncertain, but openly questioning the queen's authority for what Emma suspected might be the first time in a very long while. Queen Briar's composure faltered slightly beneath the mounting pressure of her own court's doubt, though she straightened quickly, unwilling to surrender ground so easily. "Even if what you claim is true," she said, addressing Emma directly now, "undoing centuries of tradition isn't a decision made lightly or quickly, simply because one guardian demands it." "I'm not asking you to undo it alone," Emma said. "I'm asking for the chance to restore what it was always meant to be. A partnership, not ownership. That's what the mark chose me to do. I intend to do it, with or without your permission." The court fell into a heavy, charged silence, all eyes shifting between Emma and the queen, waiting to see which of them would yield first. Queen Briar studied Emma for a long, unreadable moment, something shifting slowly behind her sharp eyes, caught between generations of tradition and the undeniable weight of truth, now standing openly before her entire court. Finally, She lowered herself back onto her throne, though the authority in her posture had visibly diminished. "Prove it, then," Queen Briar said quietly. "Prove the old agreement can be restored. But know this, Emma Brooks. If you fail, the consequences will fall on both our worlds equally." Emma held the Queen's gaze steadily, the weight of the entire court's attention settling firmly onto her shoulders. "I don't intend to fail," she said. Beside her, Adrian reached quietly for her hand, and for the first time since the knock at the cabin door, Emma felt fully ready for whatever came next. Queen Briar's permission bought Emma time, but not certainty. As she stood before the gathered court, the enormity of what she'd promised settled over her fully for the first time. Restoring an agreement broken for centuries wasn't something she could simply announce into existence. It needed to be done the way Cora's journal had described, at the source of it all. "The heart tree," Adrian said quietly beside her, as the court slowly dispersed into uneasy murmurs. "If the old agreement can be restored anywhere, it's there. It's the oldest living thing in this entire realm, older than the court itself." Queen Briar, still seated on her throne, overheard him and didn't object. Instead, she gestured for a pair of attendants to guide them, her expression unreadable but noticeably less rigid than before. The heart tree stood in a hidden grove deeper within the realm, larger than anything Emma had seen since entering the Fey world, its trunk wide enough to hold an entire room within its roots, branches stretching so high they disappeared into the soft, glowing canopy above. The air around it felt different, charged with something ancient and patient, as though the tree itself had been waiting the same way Ashwood Manor had waited, and the Crystal Caverns had waited, for someone finally willing to listen. Emma approached slowly, aware of Adrian close behind her, and Silas standing at a respectful distance near the grove's entrance, watching with quiet intensity. Word had clearly spread through the court, because more Fae had gathered along the edges of the clearing than Emma expected, drawn by curiosity, doubt, or perhaps quiet hope. She pressed her palm against the ancient bark, and the mark on her wrist responded immediately, glowing brighter than it ever had before, warm rather than urgent. Images flooded through her mind, gentler this time than the overwhelming visions in the Crystal Caverns. She saw the original agreement being formed centuries ago, not as a contract of ownership, but as a promise between two worlds choosing to protect one another. She saw the moment ambition first crept into that promise, small at first, a single ruler deciding trust took too long to build properly. She saw how easily that single choice had unraveled generations of goodwill, one small compromise at a time, until forced claiming had simply become tradition nobody questioned anymore. Emma understood, standing there with her hand against the ancient trunk, that fixing this wasn't about undoing history. It was about choosing, deliberately and openly, to return to what the agreement had always been meant to be. She closed her eyes and thought of everything that had brought her here. The fear in the cabin, the trackers in the forest, Cora's journal, the Crystal Caverns, Silas's unexpected honesty in front of his own queen, Adrian's quiet, steady trust from the very first knock at her door. She thought of choice, offered freely rather than taken by force. The mark flared brightly across her wrist, and the light spread outward from her palm into the ancient bark, traveling upward through the massive trunk and out along every branch above them. The entire grove began to glow, softly at first, then brilliantly, golden light rippling outward in slow, steady waves that Emma somehow understood weren't confined only to this clearing. Somewhere far above, in the ordinary world, the same light was surely rippling gently across the sky, over sidewalks in Seattle where flowers had bloomed out of season, over the harbor where impossible lanterns had drifted above dark water, over quiet Oregon towns where people had vanished into golden light without understanding why. When the glow finally settled, the grove felt different, lighter somehow, the air no longer carrying the same tension it had held only moments before. "It's done," Adrian said softly, wonder clear in his voice. "The covenant's restored." Queen Briar stepped forward from where she'd been watching near the grove's edge, her expression difficult to read as she studied the softly glowing heart tree. "The claiming ritual," she said slowly, "it's changed. It's a choice now," Emma said, turning to face her. "The way it always should have been. No one will be taken against their will again. Guardians will come forward when they're ready, chosen by willingness rather than force. Queen Briar was quiet for a long moment, something complicated passing behind her sharp eyes, centuries of tradition settling into an entirely new shape she hadn't chosen but could no longer deny. Finally, she inclined her head, the closest thing to genuine respect Emma had seen from her since arriving. Then it seems, the Queen said, the balance has finally been restored properly after far too long. Silas approached quietly afterward. His usual composed expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, he said to Emma, I'm glad Adrian found you before I did. Emma allowed herself a small, tired smile. For what it's worth, I'm glad you chose the truth when it mattered. In the weeks that followed, the world above slowly steadied itself. The strange lights stopped appearing over quiet Oregon towns. No one else vanished without explanation. Life in Millbrook returned gradually to its ordinary rhythm, though Emma herself was no longer quite so ordinary. She returned to her small cottage and her work at the community greenhouse, coaxing tomatoes and roses from soil that somehow felt a little richer than before. But now, tucked at the edge of the forest she once fled into out of fear, a quiet path remained open, one only she and a few trusted others could find, leading gently down into the hidden realm whenever she chose to visit. Adrian visited often, sometimes simply to walk beside her among the greenhouse rows, sometimes to help plan something new they'd started building together, gardens meant to bridge both worlds properly this time. Rare plants once known only in Fae stories began appearing carefully alongside Emma's tomatoes and roses, tended by human and Fae hands working side by side, exactly the way Cora's journal had once described, long before anyone had forgotten the promise entirely. Standing in her greenhouse one quiet evening, sunlight fading gently outside the glass walls, Emma glanced down at the faint golden mark still resting peacefully on her wrist. It didn't feel like fear anymore. It didn't even feel entirely like duty. It felt simply like home.